Hello and welcome to this Wednesday night's special broadcast of Mysteries, Graveyards, and the Human Psyche. Tonight we're going to be talking about what I now know is called a time slip. I had never heard of the proper term for these phenomena, and I had never really heard of many of these types of occurrences. But when I was a little girl, I remember going to my school's library and taking out maybe the only book about hauntings. And there was a small chapter that really intrigued me. And it was about somebody who had gone into the basement of a building and found that it was opulently decorated. It was a library. And then upon returning back to civilization and talking about this incident, people said, "What are you talking about? There's no library down there." And when he went back, it was just a regular cellar. And I remember being so intrigued by that when I was a kid. And then there was also a strange incident that happened to me when I was in my 20s, and it was New Year's Day, and one of my friends and I decided to go for a walk. And as we were walking, we seemed like we arrived at a completely different destination, and we were really disoriented as to how we had gotten there. And this is the same type of time slip that many people seem to have. Some stories seem like they're more involved than the others, than the ones that I've talked about. And the one tonight is certainly intriguing. You can hear the confusion in Anthony and Celeste as they tried to relate what was happening to them and why it was strange and why it was unusual. And I think it'll be quite clear how strange it would be if you put yourself in their shoes. And we also have our special guest this evening, Lindsay Gara, who is a cemetery tour guide, and she's going to be telling us a bit about the rural cemetery movement and taking us back to a time when strolling through the cemetery was not seen as something that was unusual or maybe gothic or emo, as the modern day people would say. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this evening's episode, Time Slip, and I will see you next week. This is a show about authentic, deep connection to the liminal spaces. Join me and my guests as we explore the boundaries between the expected and the unexplained, between the living and the dead, between heaven and earth, between everyday life and the initiation into the unseen realms. Welcome to Mysteries, Graveyards, and the Human Psyche. I'm your host, Alyssa B. In this episode,
and I want to preface this story by saying everything we're about to describe, my wife and I did not discuss until 3 days after what happened. We did not talk about what was happening to us at the time, other than to say, "Isn't that funny? Gee, isn't that weird?" And it wasn't until later we kind of realized, holy cow.
when Anthony and Celeste set out to the Greenwood Cemetery to take a stroll, they were engaging in a tradition that has kind of fallen by the wayside in our modern day society. Although it might seem strange to the modern sensibility, cemeteries like Greenwood Cemetery were really made to be open air museums. And here to tell us a little bit about that is cemetery tour guide and history enthusiast, Lindsay Gara.
Prior to rural cemeteries really kind of opening in the United States, the majority of burials really kind of took place in churchyards and city centers. So if you kind of think back to the late 17 going into that early 1800s, we had a lot of immigration to America, and the Industrial Revolution was happening. So you had all of these people moving to all of these major cities. So places like New York and Boston. Now, these areas started to get very overcrowded. And when you have that, you have things such as consumption and yellow fever and other diseases that are kind of running rampant and really kind of taking hold of entire families. And when you have that much death, you start kind of running out of room in these types of cemeteries because they're really small, like churchyards and such. Prior to the end of the Civil War, embalming wasn't a thing. So you were really just being buried in a casket, and these caskets were placed right on top of each other. So with that, you start getting the decomposition and everything happening, and then the stench. And people started to realize, like, they didn't want to live next to that. They wanted to kind of separate themselves from death. So families really started thinking, you know what, maybe it's really kind of time to move our loved ones to the country where there's more room, more open space. So that's kind of what really gave way to that rural cemetery movement. Now, one of the actual first rural cemetery to kind of establish itself in America was Mount Auburn in 1831 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And many of these types of cemeteries, like Mount Auburn and Greenwood and Sleepy Hollow, they were really designed after English landscapes. So you would have ponds and trees and plants. And it really looked like what we consider a modern day park, like in New York, like Central Park or any local park. And it was really a place, a welcoming place, a place that was beautiful to come to. Because of this, people's views of death started to change as well. They really wanted to memorialize their loved ones and be buried with them. So many families would purchase these large plots for not just a husband and wife and maybe a child, but for multi-generations. And they would hire architects and designers to build these most beautiful memorials and mausoleums and vaults. And these families would then come from New York City and really kind of make a day trip out of it. So they would get away from places like New York City and Boston, away from the pollution, away from the overcrowding and the noise, and really got to spend the day with nature. And in these cemeteries, you could stroll around a garden. You could see deer running around, rabbits. This is stuff that you wouldn't see in New York City. And even you would breathe fresh, clean air. And you definitely weren't breathing fresh air in the Industrial Revolution time period.
Thanks so much for sharing your knowledge with us, Lindsay. And now, without further ado, Anthony and Celeste's story of the Greenwood Cemetery.
Yeah. So we like to wander around. My wife and I love to go for walks, whether it's through the city streets or wherever. And so we decided at one point, let's go check out Greenwood. And we really enjoyed it. And we would go back a number of times. I don't know, this was maybe our seventh or eighth time we'd been there.
At least.
And we were very relaxed there. We weren't going there to, like, you know, sad people died, but more like, who's here, who's buried here, what's that tombstone, oh, look at that over there. It was kind of a playful, fun place to be. We weren't morbid about it. And
I mean, some of it was a little bit sad, where there would be a grave marker that was just baby, but
pretty common in Victorian art.
Because many children didn't live, to adulthood. And but sometimes it was just like the etchings on the stones, and there was such a reverence for the dead, and it really shows at at Greenwood, the reverence for those who have passed. So it's a very unusual cemetery in that respect.
And if you know your history, there's a lot of pretty famous people from the 1800s buried there. And later, Teddy Roosevelt's buried there. I think his sister's buried there. I think his mother might be buried there. Boss Tweed, who was a notoriously corrupt politician in New York, is buried there. But even more modernly, Leonard Bernstein is buried there, as is the artist Basquiat, who died young. So you've got a lot of celebrities there, along with a lot of just regular dead folk. And so this one time we went out there, and I want to preface this story by saying everything we're about to describe, my wife and I did not discuss until 3 days after what happened. We did not talk about what was happening to us at the time, other than to say, isn't that funny? Gee, isn't that weird? And it wasn't until later we kind of realized, holy cow. This took place on October 20th, 2013. It's a Saturday. And we arrived around 3 p.m. And we did our usual thing, which is just like, let's just walk down this path or that path and see where it brings us. So after a short while, Celeste keeps telling me that she's hearing children playing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, I don't hear them, but it's a big cemetery. We're kind of far from anything that would have a children's playground and that we would be able to hear it. But she kept insisting she heard it. And I said, I don't doubt you, but I don't hear it.
Yeah.
Now, the whole incident starts, Celeste and I are very different people. I'm a little bit of a kind of space cadet. I'm like, wherever I am, I'll just wander over here. I don't care. Celeste is, she's a little more meticulous. She's always taking stock of where she is and where she's going. So at one point that particular day, we get to a little, either we're going around a tree or a rock or something, you'll probably remember better. And then Celeste notices something, but I just keep wandering off. She doesn't say anything. So Celeste, you always look behind.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Celeste is very meticulous, and when she's wandering around, she always tends to turn around and see where she just was. I guess it's just a way of putting herself in space. I think
it's also the difference between being male and female, where I think females definitely always want to know where they're at.
That's true.
And true. What's going on. So there's a different hyper awareness. So yes, I'm turning and looking, and I have a very good sense of direction, but I really don't know where I am. And I'm looking on this map, and I'm turning the map, and I'm like, I can't figure out where this is. We've never been in this part of the cemetery, and I can't seem to, and it's a very basic map. It's not exceptionally detailed, but it's detailed enough so it always allows you to get back to the entrance. But I'm really struggling with this map, and neither one of us are like, I can't really figure it out. So Tony's like, just throw the map away. And I'm just appalled that that's what he says to me. Throw the map away. We can't figure it out.
It's not working. Why use it? I just
yeah. And I'm just like, no, but I can't. Well, let's just keep walking. But it's very unusual. I don't know where we are, and we've never been to this part of the cemetery before, which was very deep inside the cemetery.
I remember Celeste saying later on that when we got to this tree or rock that we went around, she turned around and she said what was behind her didn't look the same. And the best analogy I can come up with is it's almost like, if you're walking down 6th Avenue or 12th Street, and then you turn around and look behind you, and suddenly it's like 8th Avenue and 47th Street, and then you turn back ahead and it looks different. That's the best way I can describe what Celeste said. She's like, suddenly we weren't where we were a second ago, and she's confused, but I'm wandering off going, let's go over here, and she's just trying to keep up with me. So we don't talk about it. But from this point on, things start looking different. Familiar trees look different. We suddenly seem to be in a different part of the cemetery that wasn't close to where we had been, because it's almost 500 acres. And
we're like trying to figure out how we got here, because then when we finally were able to sort of locate ourselves on the map by one of the larger roads, we're like, I don't know how we would have gotten this far.
This fast.
Because this wasn't where we kind of intended to be.
And then we started noticing, there was a lot, as we wandered, a lot of robins. like more than the usual number of robins. And we also noticed a fair amount of crows, but no other birds.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of the birds that we were seeing, and we were thinking like, is it robin migration pattern? Is it? We're trying to come up with a logical reason, because at this point we don't think anything's wrong, just something's funny. And we would find trees and stuff, and we was like, that doesn't make any sense. Like these should have been bigger. And I remember at one point, a couple of times, I kept saying, well, I can see over there through the trees, there's the main building. And Celeste would look and told me later that she never saw it.
I never saw the building
Like,
he's pointing
whatever
at.
I was seeing, she wasn't seeing. And then after a while, I lost track of it too. But it's like, that should be where and then I couldn't see it anymore. So
And I'm like, I don't see that. And he's like, right there, it's right there. And I'm like, I don't see what you're pointing at. I don't see it. I'm like, I'm short, but I'm not that short.
And she was pointing out too, that like she's still hearing the children playing, these sounds of children playing.
Yeah.
And so at this point, as we're wandering around, this security guard, we see him coming by in his car, driving around the roads. So because I'm a little confused, I sort of put up my arm and I point ahead of us, and he pulls over, and he stopped to talk, and he was very friendly and chatty, in his mid-30s, very genial. And he said we were headed toward the gate at 5th Avenue and 35th Street, but that gate was already closed. And he told us to take, I wrote this down, Orchid Path to Landscape Path, and follow the first exit sign. Now, we did try that later on. It didn't work, but that's not the first thing we did.
No.
We
decided to wander a little bit down along, and we were near one of the walls, so we know like this is one of the further ends of the cemetery,
the west or north wall or whatever it was. Yeah.
So we're like, but there's an area, there was a small body of water, and on the other side of this body of water there's some mausoleums, and there's tremendous, what we were thinking was bird activity, just tremendous. Yeah, but they weren't making any noise. And we saw them up in the trees, flying about, darting on the ground and back up, but it was very overgrown over there, and
quiet.
It seemed really darker than it should have been for daylight. I'm like, it's really overgrown over here. Looked a little uncared for. So we thought,
surprised us.
Yeah, a little surprising, because most of that cemetery is so well cared for. This looked a bit overgrown. So we thought, we're going to walk around this small body of water to look at these mausoleums. And I think there were like either 4 or 6 on the other side. And as we're walking around the side, we just looked at each other, and it's like, we should just probably head out of here.
Yeah, we had stopped in our tracks, and
we
weren't
just stopped
scared.
in our tracks.
It was just like, don't go there. We weren't welcome. You said we didn't feel welcome.
We didn't discuss it at that point, but we both later on said there was a feeling of like, you're not welcome here. You should just leave. So we started to turn around.
The body of water is a place in the cemetery. It's a small pond called Del Water, and there were sort of Muslims. And we'd actually been over to this side before, a couple of trips before. But this time we kind of stopped. As we'd started going around the pond at one point, I passed these bushes, and a bunch of black things flew out of it.
Yeah.
I didn't really look at it. I thought, your mind corrects for what it should be. And I said, that's a bunch of birds. But later on, when we talked about it, they didn't look like birds. They were just sort of black shapes. And Celeste, you even said, I wrote this down when it happened at the time. You said they looked like they were animated or like CGI. They didn't really look exactly like birds.
You know what it reminded me of? The animation you see from like the 30s where they animate a bird. It was that kind of like, it looked almost animated. I mean, they almost flew like bats, but they weren't bats. But it was a very weird thing that it's like this, all these things came flying out of the tree. And I'm just like, I want to leave. I want to go. I think we should head out. And when we came back around, what was becoming apparent is, again, we lost time. We were rapidly losing daylight at that point, which really surprised us.
Because it was October. It wasn't that late.
No, it hadn't been, we hadn't changed the clocks yet back. And we were like, where have we been that we're losing light so rapidly at this point?
I do want to mention, when we were heading down by this pond, which is actually down in a little bit, there had been 3 gigantic urns blocking the road, so nobody could drive down there. And as we were going down, I remember looking back and seeing the security guard go by again on the road, and I remember thinking, like, he's looking for us.
Yeah.
And we both talked about, like, why is the security guard looking for us?
Mm-hmm.
So we get out of there, we keep wandering, we're finding unusual mausoleums we hadn't seen before. And as Celeste had mentioned, the place was really quiet. It was like, why are we not hearing birds? Why are we? Because we've been there before.
There's
we've
no
seen
children.
Hawks, squirrels, and nothing.
I'm not hearing the children. I'm not hearing birds, which you normally hear birds at night when they're settling in and their night song. You're not hearing anything. And everything is, while it's interesting, I recognize nothing. I've never, I don't seem to know anything. I don't remember this road we're going towards the gate. And we're not seeing any exit signs for the gate.
Now we did, we did find one gate that we knew about. It was in the corner of the park that actually, when you go through the gate, you go under the road and come out on the other side. And we'd walked by it before, but this time when we looked down there, it didn't look like the same street. It was like, where is that? And it looked to me almost like, is that Pennsylvania somewhere? It's like, it just didn't look like what it's supposed to be. We did at one point try to follow Orchid Path, the landscape path to the exit sign. But when we followed it, the roads he described just weren't there.
They weren't there.
It's like, wait, well, he told us to go this way and it doesn't make any sense.
No.
So, and I know at one point we're looking at trees. At one point I thought, is that a labyrinth up ahead? And we realized, no, they're bushes. But we'd been to this part of the park before, the cemetery before, and it didn't make visual sense. The trees weren't as big. The color was wrong. So,
and again, we're rapidly losing light, which is making things much more confusing for us. And we're like, this is really, really bizarre that we're walking and walking. There isn't an exit sign anywhere that this gentleman has told us that we would find.
And as we're trying to figure out how to get out, and we're sort of heading in the direction we think is the exit, here comes the security guard again, tootling up in his car. And I remember thinking to myself when I first saw him, the car looked a little old, like it wasn't quite a modern car. I'm not a car freak. I couldn't tell you what year it was, but there was a sense of like, they must have had this for a long time.
Yeah.
And he pulls up, and we told him, like, we tried to follow your instructions, and and he said, oh, you didn't follow it correctly. He kind of dismissed our concern, and then he offered, it's getting close to closing. You want me to just give you a ride to the entrance? And we hadn't talked about it, but for me, I was sitting there going like, I'm not afraid, but I just want to be out of this. I was getting tired. We've been walking for like 2 hours at this point. And I figured, you know what? My feet wouldn't mind this. Let's take us to the exit.
But we were clearly walking more than 2 hours. That was the thing,
yes,
too.
Yeah, we've been wandering
our
quite a while.
Our intention was only to be there a couple of hours, but we look and we're like, we've been here over 4 hours. This is insanity. I did not want to take the ride from the gentleman. I'm like, no. We don't need a ride. We'll walk it. And he turns and he says, if you walk it, you'll never make it. And
it's like, okay.
Okay. So I got into the car. I got into the back seat. Tony climbed in next to me. And very quickly, we were at the gate.
No, actually, you said actually, you realized we were further from the gate than you thought. He got us there quickly. But
I was amazed at how far we were. When you're in a car and you're driving at average, miles per hour, because the cemetery is completely empty. We don't see one other person, nothing. So he's just zipping along in the car. So within 5 minutes, we're at the gate. But it was a 5-minute ride driving at over 30 miles per hour that got us to the gate. And says, here you go.
And we'd been there so many times before that we kind of were aware of the scope of the cemetery, and generally speaking, so sort of like we're a little farther away from. And then he lets us out when we get to the gate.
I thought it would be a minute car ride, like he's going to go around a corner and there it is.
We'll be
but
there.
We were driving for about 5 or so minutes before we got to the gate.
And we get there, and he lets us out, and he tells us that you know, I'll just, it's not closed until 6 o'clock. I'll be around if you need any help. And we realize it's 5 o'clock. It's on
Yeah.
an October. It's not dark. It's like things seem kind of normal now at the gate. But
Yeah.
then I remember thinking, like, what was his rush to get us to the gate if we have an entire hour before the cemetery
And
closed?
again, we're not seeing other people. There's nobody near the gate when we're leaving. There's nobody around the gate.
So
You know,
Celeste-
normally there are people just milling about. You know, there's bathrooms there for people to use on their way out. So there's a
we
lot of
did.
activity at those gates.
You splashed water on your face. It's like
I
really
did. I went in there and splashed water on my face because I just didn't feel right. I kind of really wanted to get out of there. I just wanted to get home. I wanted to get back to something familiar because at that moment, nothing felt familiar. Place I had been more than half a dozen times suddenly felt really, really unfamiliar to me.
As we left, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of monk. What's the pronunciation?
Monk.
There are a lot of monk parrots that have nested in the gate, and they were kind of quiet too, because usually they're chattering and flying around. And we walked, it was like 2 or 3 blocks to the subway. We were not talking. Normally when Celeste and I walk and or do anything, we're on our way home. Oh, remember when this happened? We're not talking
It's our
about anything.
observations of the day. Like, did you see
Like,
this? Remember
yeah,
that?
yeah.
Remember this? Yeah.
Dead silence.
Complete silence.
We go by a Dunkin' Donuts that we usually stop and get like a hot chocolate at.
Or hot cider.
Yeah, just kept going. It's like, no, let's just go to
We
the subway.
stopped and then we continued to walk. Like, we didn't say anything to each other. We just were like, we're going to keep going to the subway. Got on
And
the
again-
train in silence.
All we communicated was like, gee, that's weird. Gee, that's weird. We didn't think, it's just like, we must be wrong. You try to talk yourself back into physical reality because you're saying whatever's going on doesn't make sense. So I must be misunderstanding,
Yeah.
you know. Although after a while, you know, it was like, I think we just got quiet because at the end of the day, it was just sort of like I think both of us were kind of, you know, gobsmacked of like, what just happened? But we
You
hadn't
don't
communicated.
know what just happened, and you don't know how to really articulate it in the moment. You know,
Yeah.
so you're like, something's happened. I don't feel right. I don't know how to articulate this. I'm going to sit with this because, you know, maybe I'm overreacting.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm overreacting to something. Maybe I'm having an off day. But it really didn't go away. It was very persistent days later.
So what happened was, this was a Saturday at 6 o'clock. Tuesday evening, 3 days later, Celeste and I are talking, you know, normal hanging out at home kind of stuff. And I'm like, Celeste, did you notice anything weird on Saturday at the cemetery? And it's like, I pulled the cork off of champagne. Celeste just started saying, what about this? What about that? What about this?
I'm
And
like, oh my
yes,
God.
and this and that, and this and that. What about that? The robins and the crows. Yeah, and the guy over there. Yeah, you know. And we all just were spilling out. We're recounting everything we could that we found was strange, and how much of it, you know, coincided with each other. It wasn't like I saw frogs and she saw, you know, birds. We both saw the black shapes that looked like birds. We both saw tons of robins. Well, I did see the building.
We
She
both
didn't
got
see.
that really unwelcoming feeling at the mausoleum and the Dell
The
pond.
Del Water, yeah. It's so weird. It's like we just walked and we just stopped.
Yeah.
Like it was just like it's almost like it's not that we couldn't move forward, but it was like, don't move forward. And again, not a threatening feeling as much as it's just like, you don't belong here. And,
well, I mean, if for me, it was a little bit of a sinister feeling because I had been there before. So why was I not welcome this time? We've always been really respectful when we're there. So it was not a good feeling for me personally that I felt unwelcome in a place I had been months prior in the spring. So was
that's
a
a
little
good point.
confused
Yes.
by that feeling.
I mean, I didn't feel frightened, but it was definitely kind of daunting. Like, you know, something like what doesn't want me to go here, you know?
Well, Tony and I differ in that I frighten easily. So I was like really uncomfortable.
So we started talking about this stuff and trying to make sense out of it. And, you know, what I did is I have a friend of mine who has a pretty strong psychic streak. She's not a professional psychic, but every now and then I'll just call up and say, hey, what if blah, 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 you know, and she'll tell me something she used to be does so accurately. So I called up, her name's Donna, and I said, just Donna, what happened to me and Celeste on Saturday at Greenwood Cemetery? And there was this pause. Did you guys move through space and time? And it was just like, you know, what? Because that's exactly kind of what we started thinking must have happened. Like, did we go back to the different time periods in the zone? And what was interesting is we never saw that security guard again, no matter how many times we went past. And we never saw that kind of a car again.
No.
It's almost as if like he drove out of the 1970s to drive us, to move us around, and then it was gone. So we've never seen him since. We've never seen that kind of a car since.
We didn't even see the uniforms. We realized are a little bit different now, and the hats are a little bit different.
He looked a little like a park ranger when we saw him. The new people look more like security guards.
Yeah.
So, and we didn't know his name, so it wasn't like we could say, hey, where'd Joe Smith go? Because we just didn't know.
We just asked about this guy who was maybe 30 with dark hair, and they were like, we don't know who you're talking about. No, we don't have anybody. No, we don't know who that is. And
I had actually, I wrote a lot of all this, like 3 or 4 days later, I said, I've got to write this down. I'm going to forget parts of it. And I put a lot of details in it. What I did is, if you use Google Maps on Greenwood Cemetery, you can get something very basically similar to the map that they hand out with the little roads. And I remember sitting there looking, and it's like, so we went down here, and that doesn't go there. This is like the map that I was looking at in 2013 did not make sense to what I had just experienced 3 days earlier. And Emily, and
Emily's needy.
Yeah, she
Emily is the cat.
Yes, Emily's the cat.
Cuddling.
This lump of lard. Yeah.
Cuddling with Tony right now, like a baby.
Eddie joined me earlier, but now I guess it's Emily's turn. So it was something that really kind of threw us for a loop. And then I contacted another friend of mine who is a professional psychic, and I said, could you give me any information whatsoever? And they said, if I remember wrong, Celeste will correct me, Celeste was hearing the dead children playing, that they're there in some energy form and that they were playing. And she was picking up this spiritual psychic play. Is that pretty much what?
That's what he said.
Yeah. And the funny thing was, and then psychic also told me, like, the universe is trying to get your attention, I guess, to make us aware of what can and cannot be done. And what was also interesting was that about a couple of months later, I went out to out in Long Island. There's a group called the Eyes of Learning, and they do psychic attendances and lectures and stuff that are all mystical. And I went out one night when Daniel Ackner, A-K-N-E-R, was giving a talk, and he would read some people in the audience. And I wasn't paying attention because I was with my friend Donna, the psychic person, and she was there for a reading. She was hoping she would be picked. I wasn't paying attention, and I was looking off to the side, and I heard, hey, I guess you don't want a reading. And I'm like, what? And he says, you in the pink shirt, and I was like, oh, what? And he turns to me and he gives me information. Like, he mentions my childhood address and the two addresses I grew up in, and as a child. He named the number in the street, and I'm like, well, okay, he's in tune to me,
Yeah.
And then he said, there's a cemetery that you and your wife go to a cemetery or something? And I was like, yes. And he said, and these are his words, they really like it when you show up. I'm like, what? And he said, you don't come sad. You come to enjoy the place. And there's so many people that come there, come there full of mourning, and that they like it when we visit. So I guess maybe that's why the kids were playing around Celeste. I don't know. But there was that kind of, they just, and we'd look at tombstones. Oh, we wonder, what's this family story? Oh, look, these three people who were aunts and uncles, why are they buried here? Mm-hmm. Or we'd see, like, we saw at one point earlier, we'd seen this statue of a guy standing on the tombstone with a telescope in his hand. And so we ran over there, what the heck? What did he do for a living?
Yeah.
So there was kind of a very playful curiosity, and we've been back there since. And Greenwood is very lovingly curated it's now a national landmark. It's and it's curated by a society that takes care of it. And sometimes, I think once or twice a year, they'll actually open about a dozen mausoleums, and you can have a self-guided tour. And every mausoleum you go to, there'll be somebody there to tell you, well, this was owned by the Picco king of Bushwick in 1842, and they'll show you why the mausoleum was built. And you actually get to go inside them and look around.
Yeah.
So there's a very playful feel we get when we go there, and we're really fascinated with it. So it's kind of funny to hear this guy say, like, they like when you visit because, like, you're fun, you're happy to be there. And we are. It's actually, since we've been talking about this recently, it's like, hey, we haven't been there in a couple of years. It's time to go back, and we're thinking of going later this month. And if anything happens,
we'll let you
I'll
know.
let you know.
I know. I'm thinking I should follow you with like a tape recorder and like a boom mic.
Yeah. Well, we did go back the next week, and I brought a recorder with me, and I played it the entire time thinking, well, maybe I'll pick up some EVP recordings, electro voice phenomena, but we didn't.
No.
It was just like 2 hours of wind going over the microphone. We couldn't hear anything.
I mean, it was a very different vibe that day.
Yes.
Another beautiful day, but it was a very different vibe. And I'm like, this is still lovely. It's still beautiful. Late fall, it's gorgeous. But
This was not the previous week.
This is not what we were experiencing the previous time we were here. Not at all.
Thank you so much to Lindsay Gara for teaching us about the rural cemetery movement. And thank you very much to Anthony and Celeste Picco for telling us about their experience of continuing in the tradition of the rural cemetery movement. Their stroll through the cemetery became something that was truly unique and mind-blowing. And I suspect that the telling of the story will make others who have had similar strange encounters with the unknown feel less alone and isolated. Thank you so much for sharing your story, and thank you for listening. See you next time.